This is Tech Talk. We're introducing a brand new show. This is Kurt Steele from Tech AM Power Drive, and we want to introduce Scott Miller, who's kicking off a show today. We are super excited to have Scott, you a part of the family. Why don't you introduce your guests?
All right. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Tech Talk. I'm Scott Miller, and my co-hosts are Andrew and Vlad, and we're the usual suspects that are going to be discussing tech with you every Tuesday. So we want to just jump right in, remind you, of course, you can call in on the, you can call in on the number that's on the website, and we'll just jump right in. And Vlad, you've got the first story. We want to talk about what's been on everybody's mind this week, WannaCry and ransomware.
Yes, so ransomware has been in the news. For those not familiar with what it is, it's essentially malicious software that installs itself on the victim's machine and starts to encrypt files. Once it encrypts enough files, it puts up a screen telling the victim that their files are encrypted and advises them how they can get their files back. It will ask for a ransom, typically to be paid in Bitcoin or Litecoin or some other cryptocurrency. This particular vulnerability is really interesting. It's part of vulnerabilities that were released in an NSA leak, and it's been weaponized. Microsoft did issue a patch, so if you have not patched your Windows yet, I highly recommend you do. Also, you should not have Samba or Windows file sharing exposed to the internet. Microsoft actually took a very unusual step. It released a patch for going as far back as Windows XP, which has been out of support for quite a few years now.
Vlad, I know the main recommendation is patch your systems, but are there any recommendations for systems that aren't easily patched? For instance, there are a lot of medical systems that, and medical equipment actually still running XP and well, not anything older. I think XP is the oldest, but they might not be easily patched since they have those really unique drivers that, work with the equipment.
Yes, so medical equipment can actually be isolated. A lot of medical equipment can be placed on its own network, on its own VLAN, or actually completely be removed from network in many cases. Users can also disable file sharing, which is the Windows file sharing that lets you share files over Samba. Mm-hmm. We actually know of a few cases with large national banks that still use XP, primarily because their ATMs run it, and those suckers have to be connected to a network.
Really? Windows XP on ATMs?
Yes. We know because during an assessment, the Windows XP reinstall CDs and drivers were found inside an ATM that was picked open.
Huh.
And that's probably Windows XP embedded, and there was a little more support from Microsoft for their embedded product lines because of that. But still, Windows XP, Windows 7 is definitely really prevalent in the embedded world for sure.
Yeah, that brings up a point actually for small business and home users. It's time to get rid of Windows 7, or at least really considering what you're going to do to go beyond Windows 7 and move to 8.10. Windows 8 or Windows 10. And
it's just a matter of maintaining the life of all of your software, before it goes into life, and have a plan to maintain it or get rid of it if you're not going to use it, or if it's no longer supported. I mean,
other than patching, which is done automatically if you don't mess with the default settings in Windows 8 and Windows 10. What other things can people do to harden their home systems and small office systems, where they might have several computers connecting to the internet but not even have a server?
So one thing is having an actual firewall or a firewall type device that will restrict which services are available to the internet. For most home users, that means no services available to the internet. More and more home routers actually let you restrict outbound connections, so you can actually blacklist large chunks of IP space. You can also use your DNS to prevent your machine from beaconing out to certain portions of the internet and to block a lot of known adware sites, malware domains, and those lists get updated fairly regularly.
Yeah, real-time blacklists look to geographically block countries that you're not doing business with, such as China,
and .ru.
Exactly. There's a lot of ways. Definitely, residential routers have become much more sophisticated, and it's easier to block that traffic. Instead of plugging your cable or DSL modem straight into your computer, you have your router firewall in between there to protect you from that.
It's funny, people like to call out China and Russia, but much more malicious traffic actually comes in from Romania.
Really?
Yeah.
What are they putting in the water over there?
They're putting in a really excellent education and lack of economic progress in their water supply.
Good combination for some hackers.
Okay, the call-in number is 844-790-TALK. That's 844-790-TALK. We invite you to join the conversation. One thing in the lead into the show that we talked about this morning was privacy issues, and a particular one that I wanted to raise today was privacy for children, privacy for youngsters, mostly under 13, so they're guarded from that by law if parents enforce it, that they don't have Facebook accounts and things like that. But after they hit 13, it's a whole other ballgame. What do you do? And what do you do on smaller devices, where it's not so much having a social media account as it is putting on apps and things that tend to want to make children the product?
I believe it was Amazon and Apple. They had to settle several lawsuits where kids were making in-app purchases where additional authorization wasn't required. So they were racking up points in whichever game, and they needed in-game items to get further in the game. So I think the reason, the logic behind the lawsuit was specifically that the kids were not authorized to make those purchases, and in many cases they were under 13.
Right. Yeah, location services, in-app purchases, adult content, chatting with others. If you can't look at your child's tablet or their computer and know exactly what they're doing, then they shouldn't be doing it. That's my opinion.
And of course, the big one is stranger danger. You have no idea who they're actually chatting with. You have no idea that the person they added as a friend on whatever social network, you don't know who they actually are.
Right. If they're not old enough to travel the world alone, then they shouldn't be on the internet alone.
So, I mean, but what do you do? I mean, you can't just stop them from using the internet, and they're going to use social media, particularly when they hit 13.
Well, that's a great question.
We'll
get to that after the break here.
And we're back. Okay, Andrew, you were talking about privacy before we were interrupted to pay the bills.
Hey, well, glad to be back. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can always call in at 844-790-TALK. Feel free to call in and ask any questions. Yeah, we're talking about children's privacy, and we had some ideas and some practical experience that we've had over the years, being cybersecurity professionals and just working in IT, and also just being geeks. So some of the things we talked about to look out for your apps that your children use, or your applications, or the stuff that they use on the internet for their computer. For example, on tablets, are really easy to come by. Most young kids have phones these days, and there's apps that you can install. But things to look out for are, one, in-app purchases, location-based tracking information, ads, chat. What else was there, Vlad?
We mentioned location tracking and location sharing, I believe.
Location sharing, there we go. Like the new Pokemon game, that was very exciting for everyone. A lot of people got into it, but that's not something you want your children to be playing alone. There's even issues with children running around playing the game, going into parks, and as Vlad mentioned earlier, stranger danger, which is obviously very real. So you got to really look out for that, and there are ways to mitigate that. For many years since the internet has been around, ever since I was on dial-up internet providers working in those companies, I used to tell providers, or tell my clients, if your child isn't old enough to travel the internet, if your child isn't old enough to travel the world alone, they shouldn't be on the internet alone. You need to be able to look at their screen and understand exactly who it is they're talking to, what they're doing, and so on. So that's some good advice that I have for your children and privacy online.
One thing I also recommend is mobile device management. It's a little bit more involved than a lot of other solutions. But what you could do is you can actually install this mobile device management on all the phones in your household and all the laptops. And you can actually have a router that can enforce mobile device management as well. So you can actually restrict certain sites from being visited during certain parts of the day from specific devices. So, for example, you could block Susie's phone from having internet access after 9 p.m. And it also allows you to track your kid's phone.
Absolutely, great point, Vlad.
There's nothing like lowjacking your children.
Hey, there's good reason to.
Yes, no argument here.
Or if they're 13 years old on the internet, there's no reason to be able, no reason not to look over the shoulder and understand what they're doing and who they're talking to and so on. And to get them to understand the responsibility of the information that they put out on the internet. It's always there. They're digital fingerprints, digital tattoos that will stay forever.
All right, before we go on to our next story, we want to thank our underwriter, Spirent Federal Systems. And they're due, well, Andrew's got the story on Spirent.
Okay. Yeah, so we're sponsored by Spirent Federal Security Labs, where services are structured to produce high-impact results with minimal impact on your organization. Spirent Federal Security Labs has dedicated teams of experienced security professionals offering comprehensive scanning, penetration testing, and monitoring services for networks, wireless, websites, mobile applications, embedded devices, as well as static source code analysis. Contact Spirent Federal for your complete range of security services at spirentfederal.com.
All right, so the next thing we were going to go on to was the new generation of spy devices. We were talking about things with small office, home office, and that particularly relates to VoIP. And Vlad was talking before the show about how that's generated a whole new set of devices where people are using for spying on and taking intellectual property.
Yes, so for a lot of small businesses and even a lot of the larger technology companies, their primary asset is their intellectual property. It's their business plans for what they plan to do in the near future, for what they plan to do 12, 18 months out, and how they're going to get there. What we've seen is a resurgence in traditional spy devices being deployed against small and medium enterprise, as well as larger organizations, specifically technologically oriented organizations and organizations that deal with highly confidential information. I got to learn about a new sort of device today. Did you know what a nonlinear junction detector is?
No.
I had no idea until you showed it to me, Vlad. So I started Googling and reading about it.
So without being too specific and plugging for any of the companies, it's essentially a device that transmits and receives on a specific frequency at the same time. And what it does is it listens to the data that comes back. It energizes any potential electronic circuits that are within range, and then it looks at the second and third harmonic. And it compares the difference between second and third harmonic to identify between actual electronic circuits that might not even be powered on, and things like rusty doornails that are embedded in the wall.
So even burst transmitters that only transmit very infrequently throughout the day, you can still find those.
Exactly. So according to the stats that I got from somebody who just got out of the industry after doing it the entire lifetime this past December, the hit rate is actually about 10% for finding transmitters when it's done by the federal government. So this new technique allows somebody to find even a burst transmitter that's been turned off, that's completely disabled, simply because it has the circuit board and has the transistors and diodes on the circuit board.
So now you were talking more about VoIP stuff before the show. I mean, is that where they're finding them? Is masquerading as VoIP devices?
No, actually, this allows you to plant the bug without actually visiting the building. So if you have a highly secured environment, you may not be able to gain access to a particular office. But many times those offices will have a VoIP phone on the desk, in some cases even two VoIP phones, because one is for the more secure environment and the other one's for external calls. So what happens is somebody would actually hack the VoIP network and place the phone into speakerphone mode without the phone actually displaying that it's in a call, and listening to conversations within offices and conversations within conference rooms. So they're using the organization's own infrastructure against them.
And it's the same thing as hacking like all those video cameras. It's just embedded firmware on an embedded device, a voice over IP conference phone or a voice over IP phone on your desk. It runs software on firmware. It runs software in the hardware. Exploit that, and it's just like all those video cameras that became a big botnet to attack Twitter and Netflix.
except
Or
a
the
lot of
same-
secure environments may not have cameras. And as we mentioned, people often don't patch devices. We know to patch our laptops, at least we should. But when we buy a consumer device, such as a phone, especially a desk phone or some kind of a router or a camera, it gets plugged in, and as soon as it's working, we forget about it. We only remember about it when it stops working.
Right.
You know, in the Internet of Things and in with things like cameras and phones are separate, but like cameras and stuff, how often are their firmwares updated, even if someone wanted to be vigilant?
Some manufacturers are very good about pushing out firmware, anytime from twice a year to even one time a year. A lot of times they're done in response to an unfolding incident, such as Mirai botnet spraying across.
All
Yeah,
right.
it varies across the market from different manufacturers. So when you're looking to buy equipment, you can certainly do that research and find good manufacturers that will maintain their equipment for the time of life. There's some amount of manufacturers that are better than others, but at least once or twice a year, you'll see a security update for your residential router, your webcam, or your home security system. It's quite common these days, are internet-based. Very important things to keep updated from your vendor. And if they're not updated, ask the vendor, the manufacturer, to get it updated. Complain.
And for things like the Internet of Things, please change the default password.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. You cannot even overstate these things. It's so simple. Not expose it directly to the internet unless it's absolutely necessary. And if it's secured appropriately, change the default password. Segregate it from the rest of your network and your other clients and so on. There's lots of things you can do that simply protect your devices.
And not just change the password, make it a good password. Something like your home's phone number, the CEO of the organization with devices deployed are all good examples of passwords that should be avoided.
Do not use those passwords because you can easily just Google that and try the password. And hackers will try that. Criminals will try that to gain access because it's that obvious. Sometimes it's the lowest hanging fruit to get the most profit from for a cyber criminal.
I make my life difficult because I use a password generator, and then I always have these really long passwords that are such a pain in the ass to type when I have to. But
it's very important. I use a password manager for important things, and nowadays with all the leaks that are happening and the breaches that are happening in websites, it's not. It's more of just if. It's not even if when you're going to get. It's when. All these websites eventually will have a security breach, and your personal PII will get out, your personal identifiable information, and your passwords will get leaked. So don't reuse passwords for sure. So password managers are very good. I use 1Password, and there's other ones out there, but definitely do the research and we can make recommendations. But I use them for important websites, and it saves you a lot of headache if there is a security breach.
Also, by having good, unique passwords, when there is a breach, and some people may not know the source, by looking at the information in the leak and looking at your password that was leaked, you may be able to determine where the leak came from.
Right. Yeah. Lots of good ways to do that.
all right, let's go for another break, and we'll be back after that. Welcome back. Remember, you can join the conversation at 844-790-TALK. All right, Andrew, we want to jump right in, and we're going to talk about some bug bounty programs.
Okay. Yeah, kind of like that. So back in the day when people were hacking and finding vulnerabilities and whatnot, they just keep them for themselves. It was more profitable just to keep them for themselves and to trade them. But then it kind of changed where they'd get some street cred or some notoriety by submitting vulnerabilities and hacks to the software makers. But now there's been a new evolution that's come out over the last few years, and they're called bug bounties, where the manufacturers of these softwares, such as Google and Apple and so on, these large people, even Cisco and some others, they run a bug bounty. And so that if you find a vulnerability or you have an exploit for the software, they'll pay you for it. So you demonstrate it not by hacking them illegally, but you show them where the vulnerability is and you show them your security research, and they'll pay you good money for it. There's even a kid who got something like $10,000 for a simple hack on Instagram, and the kid was like 10 years old. So here's an article I found, and it's where Apple just recently fixed 66 vulnerabilities across 7 product lines, including Safari, iTunes, macOS, iOS. This just came out yesterday, on Monday. Now, why I hung this home is because we're all talking about how it's important to keep your stuff updated. And people always give the hate towards Microsoft or Windows because a lot of malware is targeted towards that because it's the largest demographic. But it also is very important, and don't ever underestimate this. But the myth that Apple hardware and software is immune to malware and ransomware and viruses is not the case. And here it is. Many of the fixes across macOS and Safari resolve vulnerabilities uncovered in Own to Own, which is the hacking contest held at CanSec West each year. Contestants can collectively earn $143,000 poking holes in Apple products when the competition is held in March. So there's a lot to be said where people can earn some money and they can do the right thing being a responsible hacker to help these products become better. Now, this can also be said that it's on the responsibility of Apple to do this and that they're giving it for free work and so on, but this is progress regardless. The Department of Defense even had a big bug bounty program, and that is very profitable for them because vulnerable systems is a huge issue for the Department of Defense and their vast federal networks and enterprise, and they simply do not have the personnel to go through everything all the time. So I'm sure Vlad has some stuff to talk about that, and I can continue on some more details on that. But that's the story I wanted to talk about, was bug bounties and the vulnerabilities, and even it's important to patch your Apple stuff.
Excellent point about patching. So for the longest time, there was a perception that Mac and Apple hardware was more secure. As the user base grew, I kind of feel like the arrogance level grew as well. And I hate to say this as I'm talking into my Mac machine right now. But there is a perception that the machines are more secure, and I feel like there's less of a culture of importance in patching. You know that Microsoft Patch Tuesday happens, and everyone rushes to first patch their machines, and then to grab the patches, reverse engineer them, and turn them into weaponized exploits. You have not seen this, that as much with Macs, but that is really starting to change. I attribute it to the growth of the user base of the Apple machines. As far as bug bounties go, my personal view on them is I'm against them. I feel like the people who identify vulnerabilities are being shortchanged. They're not profiting from their work as much as they can. I think it can create a conflict of interest with their day job, especially if they're security consultants. You're essentially stealing time from your job when you're working on something that's not a client project. It may be against your terms of employment. And even if you are allowed to do it, I feel like the vulnerability can be better leveraged on open market, perhaps even being sold closed source back to the vendor instead of selling it for a mere $5,000. I think it could be worth 10 times that in open market. And that's really going to push vendors to perform better security audits on their own hardware and software.
Right. Well, you bring up valid points, Vlad, and I appreciate that. That's a good perspective. But I feel that I agree on what you're saying, but I think it's still some progress. Before, it was just totally bad, and people hid it, and it was all underground. And then there was some brokerage companies who would broker 0 days. I was trying to remember ZDI. I'm going to forget the name. But I think it's progress. And I definitely saw it as progress for the Department of Defense, but I agree. It certainly can be an easy conflict of interest, and it burns time. And also these vulnerabilities and exploits are worth far much more money than they get out of a bug bounty.
Andrew gave me a perfect segue because you started talking about 0 days. And as you know, it wasn't a 0 day, but WannaCry was actually, released, and the NSA had been holding on to it to use even though it had been known for quite a while. And I wanted to talk to you about the idea of government agencies acquiring 0 days or discovering 0 days and holding on to them.
Right.
And, and not releasing them back to the vendors so that they can be patched. So
I can answer that in several different ways. But my opinion is this, and it's to remind everyone that spy agencies spy. Believe it or not, that's what they do. And they use the tools of their trade to do such spying and so on. I agree that there's a very blurry gray line there between responsible disclosure from a government agency to company that is protecting their clients and so on, or to protect national security. That's a cooperative between Microsoft and those agencies within the government. But that's an end-of-life product, totally end-of-life for many, many, many years. And so I don't necessarily blame NSA for that. I blame the leakers, and I blame the people who weaponized it. These vulnerabilities have been out there for over a decade. But it takes the mindset of a criminal to glue it all together to turn it into something far worse. And I believe confidently that the three-letter agencies and our government does have cooperation with Microsoft and so on. And also Microsoft probably knew about this and they just never fixed it because it's end of life and gone. Vlad, you got any thoughts on that?
I would go even further than that. If you look at who was impacted by this vulnerability and by this worm, you'll see that there were machines being compromised and crypto-locked all across China, all across Russia. Government organizations in China were complaining about being hit. That tells me NSA is doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. That means they have exactly the right exploits to get their job done. That is their prerogative. Who I do blame in this case is Microsoft for releasing insecure software and the end users for not patching.
Right.
I think NSA is 100% in the right about this for having effective exploits.
And there's no proof that any of this is being used on American peoples or being used inappropriately. There's never that.
Well, it might be being used against Americans, but it might be being used by other foreign governments. If NSA discovered it, they don't know what other foreign nations also discovered the same vulnerability and wrote their own exploit for it.
Right.
Do you think there's any difference in the NSA holding on to 0 days they discover and the idea of buying 0 days from basically from hackers and things like that? Or is it all the same?
I think it's all the same. There's no indication the NSA actually discovered this vulnerability. We knew NSA had this exploit, but for all we know, they bought it from some 12-year-old on the internet.
Right. Yeah. There's no proof either way that they developed it themselves. All they proved is that they had this vulnerability known and they had an exploit for it, and that's it. They didn't know when it was last used, who was using it, and so on. All it is just a leak of a vulnerability. They have tools. It's no different if someone working there leaked a fancy bug device and they put it out on the internet. Hey, look at this bug NSA uses. Yeah, they're spies. That's their job. They spy. Like, that's what their job is. Like, they're chartered for this. It's in the so what more can be said about that?
Okay. And Andrew gets the last word. Now, staying on the idea of spying, I'm sorry, not staying on the idea of spying, I want to talk about another thing that's been in the news for quite a while, and it looks like it's going to be coming to a head soon, and that is net neutrality.
Right.
And so first of all, I'd like each of your thoughts on net neutrality. I'll be surprised if we have anyone here who's not a net neutrality fan, but Andrew?
Well, remember, anyone can call in and ask questions or give us commentary at 1-844-790-TALK. Feel free to join us. I have my opinion is this, and I kind of compare net neutrality to toll roads and express lanes. And I see it. I live in Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, work in the defense market, and I have the toll pay device, and I also pay for the express lane. But one thing I notice, and I can't help but notice it, is that when I go down the freeway in the express lane, it's always much nicer cars than the cars that are stuck in traffic in the non-express lane. And this is what it looks like and how I translate this to net neutrality, is that if we go away from having an equal access to internet, is that there will be prime people who have the higher class of living or higher class of internet access who will get better access to essential information that's on the internet or essential entertainment or essential financial data. It's inequality. And that's not how the internet was designed to be used or to be implemented in a commercial fashion, whether you call it capitalism or what have you. But I believe equal access should be across the board. And regardless of if that's access to education or access to Netflix or access to the dark net, whatever it may be, there should be no limits. It should just be equal access based on the amount of speed that you can pay for and buy. But What happens when we get away from net neutrality, and I'll end with this, is that those backroom dealings will start to happen between the large backbones and the large providers who provide the content. And then we lose control, and we lose access, and so on. So I'll hand it back to you. Those are my opinions briefly on net neutrality.
Vlad?
I agree to a large extent. So I think that by starting to prioritize traffic, you're actually going to stifle innovation. You're going to stifle the smaller companies that don't have the budget for more bandwidth. They may have spent whatever little venture capital they had, which might be just their own savings account, to develop this really great new platform, but you might not ever get a chance to try out this new platform and see it for its full potential because Netflix might be paying to decrease their bandwidth by increasing their own bandwidth.
I agree with you, Vlad, and I want to take it a step further, and that is that it would really affect podcasts because unless you were one of the major podcasts, you couldn't afford to be in that fast lane.
Right.
And so,
quality, access, advertising, you get limited in many, many different ways, and it trickles across the whole spectrum.
And for our listeners who you can join us on 1-844-790-TALK. I want to remind our listeners not to live under a rock and realize that the FCC is accepting comments right now on net neutrality, and you should go to the website and join in on making a comment. And we'll give that URL and everything after the break. Okay, welcome back to Tech Talk with the usual suspects. We were talking right before the break about net neutrality, and we were discussing all of our support for it, actually. But whether you support it or not, you think you should participate in the conversation. And to do that, go to fcc.gov. There you can make comments on net neutrality, either for or against. And also what's interesting is you can read other people's comments. When you do comment on this website, it is a public record, so everyone else will be able to read it. Just to give more information, like I said, you go to fcc.gov, and at the top of the menu bar there is filings and search proceedings. And once you're there, you're looking for the one that says the Internet Freedom Restoration Act. And I know that government agencies like to give bizarre names to things. You can find it also because on the left side there's a link for the most commented on, and if you click that, the Internet Freedom Restoration Act is the first one. So that's fcc.gov. All right. So now that we've got our listeners going, and I'll be politically active, what else are we going to talk about? Vlad, you were talking on the break that you wanted to talk about car security.
Absolutely. Cars used to be just relatively simple machines. You had your engine, you had your transmission, you had your wheels. But now you have infotainment systems that have built-in 4G modems. In many cases, several 4G modems. You have real-time telemetry being sent back to the manufacturer. You have mobile apps to let you lock and non-lock doors, start and stop a vehicle, even remotely disable the vehicle and put it into stolen vehicle mode, which essentially slows the vehicle down to 15 miles an hour. You have information about your tire pressure systems being sent. In some cases, you're able to interact with the CAN bus, which directly controls your life safety systems like your airbags and your braking systems through the OBD2 port that's under your steering wheel. One really interesting thing is you also have control from a satellite using the XM radio. You can actually provision and deprovision hardware inside your vehicle and even your entire infotainment system by a signal that gets regularly sent from the XM satellite. So it's not just your subscription.
No, wait.
Remote start.
You're saying that you can provision and deprovision things outside of the infotainment system or only in the infotainment system?
Outside the infotainment system, because it sends a packet that's encoded, and the infotainment system decodes the packet and then puts it on an internal car network, because now you have vehicle Ethernet, and other car components can actually interpret that information, and they'll know to provision or deprovision themselves. I've actually seen an update for a backup camera happen this way, and a backup camera system be disabled until it can be fixed at the dealer.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. the internal networks for cars, that it was built by design to have absolutely zero security mechanisms or controls built into it.
Exactly.
Maybe new versions.
The priority on the car network is to reliably get messages to other components. Security is very much an afterthought.
Yeah. Now, if they kept them segregated and used other network philosophies or other IT philosophies, principles of security such as least privilege access, principles of least privilege. There's many ways that they could very simply fix these things, but the auto industry doesn't look at it like that. They look at it as an automobile, even though they're now tying it to Ethernet and tying it to all these high-tech Internet of Things and whatnot. If they segregated it and kept the infotainment on a separate network and never let that talk to the CAN bus or to the internal car network, it would be a million times better, but they don't. They just simply ignore it.
There is some segregation. So most vehicles have two systems, at least. You have the high-speed bus and the low-speed bus. The high-speed bus is your life-critical systems. As I mentioned, that's your airbag deployment events, that's your anti-lock braking system, that's your seatbelt ratcheting system, because it's no longer just a dumb spring. Now it's a whole electronic system that'll actually tension up your seatbelt when it senses that a crash is imminent. And by the way the vehicle knows that a crash is imminent is no longer from just a biosensor being hit. It could be from a radar or a LiDAR system now telling the car that it's about to enter a crash condition. And then you have your low-speed bus. That's things like turning on the lights, radio volume. But in some cases, the infotainment system is so tightly integrated into the car, they can actually pass messages onto the high-speed bus, or at least read messages. And if you were to tamper with the firmware, you can actually write messages to the high-speed bus.
All right. I'm just surprised that cars are still using security as an afterthought. I mean, the same kind of thing happened when they went to smart meters for electricity and such, but you would think that the car manufacturers would have learned from their mistakes and not have made security an afterthought.
Well, it's been going on for about 10 years now, and I don't really see a whole lot changing. I mean, we're pushing into the market. Maybe there's some reception or some receptiveness to get some work done to participate in securing and auditing and so on. At least now there's still the DMCA exemption, which allows, and that was a big issue for commentary to be applied to the government so that they keep that exemption in place so that hobbyists and I forget the exact wording, Vlad, but it was hobbyists and good faith.
And security researchers in good faith, yes.
Good faith and considered. So we can legally audit your equipment. You can legally hack on your stuff and report vulnerabilities without getting in trouble with the law. That's huge progress. And this is one of the exemptions that they graciously left in the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act. But that's one of the things that's great about our country is that you can have that voice. You can go to the FCC.gov and you can talk about these things like DMCA and net neutrality, and they have to listen. It goes on public record. So I encourage you guys all out there listening, please, if you want to call in, you have any comments, feel free to ask any questions, call in at 844-790-TALK, and please go to FCC.gov and give your commentary on net neutrality. Back to you, Scott.
All right. Well, I was just about to come around and let everyone have a couple minutes for their closing comments. I wanted to close with a slightly humorous one and get off of security for a moment, talking about car security. Since it's an afterthought, you have basically an open network. What I'm waiting for and what I think the next moneymaker is going to be, the next Facebook, if you will, is someone who figures out how to have a social network between cars.
Oh, God. Well, there is a specification for vehicle-vehicle communication. So this is not impossible, Scott.
Yeah, and, I'm thinking, it could be like, a dating application, right? You see someone you like driving down the street, you each get something in your car.
For that. Privacy, security, cyber stalking, stranger danger. This is all I hear, Scott. This is all I hear you say.
The vehicle-to-vehicle network, which is commonly known as V2V, is supposed to have some protection against it. It's supposed to change the vehicle ID every 15 minutes. But the algorithm, it's actually done so that advertisers can't track you. Because otherwise advertiser billboards would just track your vehicle continuously.
Wow.
But there are some issues with the way that it's being done. It's a very predictive algorithm, and your car puts out so much other RF that you can easily track a car, as I mentioned, using TPMS, the tire pressure monitoring system. Unless you change all 4 tires in your TPMS sensors, your car is still very much unique. Plus the Bluetooth signature of your vehicle, Wi-Fi if your car has it, 4G modem is just too easy to uniquely identify a vehicle.
Yeah, and next week we can talk about a company and engineers, researchers that I know working on just that, fingerprinting vehicles, anaerobe security. And then let's also not forget, Shadow Brokers is planning on a monthly exploit and data dump service. So the very same people that brought us the vulnerabilities and the exploits that are ransomwaring all over the world right now, the Shadow Brokers who stole the information from the NSA, CIA, they're also going to be doing more leaks and more threats, and they're ransoming it as well. So unless someone pays up to keep quiet, they're going to do that. So that's my closing story, and that's all I got.
All right, Vlad, your closing comments?
I would definitely urge people to go to the FCC website and leave a comment. I'm biased, but I would urge people to ask the FCC to keep internet open for everyone.
All right, and my final comments, of course, remember, patch your systems. We've talked about privacy for your kids. The main thing to learn on that is you've got to learn to take control. After all, I know parents take their role very seriously, but sometimes it's hard to remember. You've got to be the adult, even if it's unpopular, and control those things that they put on their phones and the sites that they visit. I know some families, what they do is that the family computer is in a family area. They don't allow the kids to have a computer in their rooms. I'm not sure if I would go that far, but it's something to consider. But definitely for kids under 13, you should be controlling everything they put on their phone or on their tablet. And
be sure to tune in next week. We'll have our website up and an email address, and feel free to call in.
Yes, we're definitely going through growing pains this week, and we'll have everything set for next week. And of course, remember, you can call in any time on the call-in line, or you can email go to our website. And of course, if you're listening on the stream, we'll have a podcast up so you can, for those who want to repeat it. Once again, I want to say good afternoon to everyone for Tech Talk and the usual suspects, and thank you for listening.
And thank you, Spirent Federal, for sponsoring.